This week, the topic of our training is following directions. And I'm Tiffany Cochran. I'm a board certified behavior analyst and director of autism advocacy and intervention. And Sarah might be with us today. She's a registered behavior technician who also works for autism advocacy and intervention, and she supports specific Head Start classrooms. And we're able to bring you these trainings due to a partnership that we have with Head Start locations in the Northeast Kingdom. All of the trainings are posted to the Autism AI website, which is found at this address, autismai.com, and also posted to the Autism Advocacy and Intervention YouTube channel. Okay, so if we're talking about following directions, one of the first things that we should talk about is how to define the problem behavior, which is usually called non-compliance. So, non-compliance can really be broken down into 4 different categories, and these categories are passive non-compliance. So that's like when a kid's walking away or ignoring you, or they just keep on doing what they're doing and completely don't acknowledge that you gave a direction. There are simple refusals. So this is when a child or a person says no or otherwise outwardly refuses to do something or indicates, by shaking their head or gesturally that they don't plan on doing what they've been asked to do. A simple refusal is really not an angry outburst or anything like that. It's just kind of a simple no. There's direct defiance. Direct defiance is refusing paired with an escalation in behavior. So this is the yelling, escalation in whining or crying, protesting, maybe kids who, when they're asked to do something, they hit or they, dump toys or something like that. That would be a direct defiance. And then negotiation. So bargaining and compromise kind of fall into this 4th category. And these different categories were actually identified by, I believe it was Walker et al. I have a bunch of resources for you guys at the end of this training because I did rely a little bit on the behavior analytic research for this one. So there are some articles for those of you who are interested in delving a little deeper in that. But I just wanted to make sure I didn't come up with these categories. They were outlined by another behavior analyst. So when we're talking about following directions or compliance, what we're talking about is really a skill that kids need to learn. Children aren't born knowing how to follow directions. It's something they learn over time. It's a skill. It requires practice. It requires repetition. And one of the most important things when you're talking about compliance and repetition of compliant behaviors or following directions is having consistent follow through and consistent sort of prompting measures from the person providing the instruction. People learn direction following behaviors in relation to how the direction's presented and the outcomes of following or not following the direction. So in the past weeks, we've talked about the relationship, the antecedent behavior consequence relationship. And this is really important when we're talking about shaping up some good direction following behaviors. And then just keep in mind throughout this that changing expectations of a parent or a caregiver or teacher can really impact a child's compliance overall. So if one day it's expected that the child follows all the directions and there's really good follow through and consistent consequences, and then the next day there isn't, over time, the child's going to learn that the parent's a little bit wishy-washy when they provide an instruction, and they're less likely to try to follow that in the first place. And before we go too far into this, I do want to say too much compliance can be a bad thing. So whenever I'm working with kids who are non-compliant, I am very cautious of not creating a child who always follows the direction to a T from any adult. It can put a child in a really dangerous situation where others could take advantage of them. And teaching them really good refusal skills that are effective and appropriate to certain situations is an important thing to keep in mind in this situation as well. So, should kids follow all adult directions? No, they shouldn't. Yes, we want them to follow our directions as their caregivers. We want them to follow mom and dad's instructions or directions, maybe grandma's, and maybe the babysitters. But it's also important to teach kids some safety skills so that they're not putting themselves in a position where they'll follow any direction given by an adult, especially directions given by a stranger. So, how do you teach your kids which directions to follow and which to ignore? I actually don't really have a great answer to that question. What I would say is it's important to keep some open dialogue with your kids around um, not talking to strangers or around their own personal safety. You don't want them in a situation where they automatically feel that because an adult's telling them to do something that they have to do it. Now, that being said, we do want them to follow our own instructions. So the best way to teach them is to be consistent in the way that you deliver your instructions to your children, whether you're a teacher or a parent, and um, be conscious of teaching them some active refusal skills, teach them situations that they might need to talk to an adult about, talk to them about when it might be okay to delay things or compromise. Um, and sometimes when you're giving instructions, if their option is to not do the activity that you're asking them to do, then teach them when it's okay to say no, when it's okay to say, no, I'm not really interested in that. I don't really want to do that. Or that doesn't sound very safe to me. And teach them some really nice verbal ways to express that.
Tiffany, I have something to add about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
What if there was a dialogue between you and the child saying maybe asking another adult if it's not someone as a parent saying telling them to do something, maybe asking an adult to make sure that they're not going against what you would want them to do?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question. Can you?
So for instance, my children have a nana that likes to give out candy, and for a while it was because it's nana or she's an adult, she says it's okay. But from now on, I'm telling them that it's not just nana, and they can't accept candy unless they ask me or their father first.
Oh,
So
okay.
asking like another adult. So instead of saying, how do you teach a child which adult to listen to and which one not to, how about instead of saying don't listen to them, asking another adult if it's not an adult that they don't know, like having a second opinion.
I think that's great feedback and a really great way to kind of work around that difficult situation. I always bring up this issue of should kids follow directions from everyone, and it's a really tough situation because it's hard for kids to discriminate. But if you have the ability to set some really clear guidelines for your kids, like being able to tell them, yeah, if somebody's asking you to do something, just come check with me first before you do it. I think that's a really good strategy for dealing with that kind of situation. And especially if you're able to break it down into specific scenarios, like, if grandma's offering you candy, you've got to check with me first because I know how much candy you've had today. So I think that that's a really good strategy, and thank you for bringing that one up.
Yeah.
So the first thing you want to do when you're talking about teaching kids how to follow directions or how to be a little bit more compliant is identify which targets you want to start working on to practice these strategies on. So the targets should really be something that's already a mastered skill or something that can be broken down into easy to execute steps. I use the example here of brushing your teeth versus the steps of putting toothpaste on the brush, put the brush in your mouth. So for a child who doesn't necessarily have teeth brushing skills that they can independently execute, you would want to break that down into smaller, more manageable steps. And that can sometimes just breaking stuff down into smaller steps will increase compliance without really having to do that much more. But for kids who are resistant because they're, wanting to continue watching TV, but they know how to brush their teeth, or they want to, have just 5 more minutes doing what they're doing, those are kids that you might need some more in depth strategies to build some compliance and direction following behaviors. And then choose targets that are problematic and try to identify what's contributing to those targets being a problem. So again, with the idea of toothbrushing, if this is consistently problematic, you'd want to look at those antecedents and consequences. The behavior you're looking for is brushing your teeth. When mom or dad or grandma says it's time to go brush your teeth, that's when you want the child to go do it. But are there some factors that are contributing that you can change around as the caregiver to try to make it so it's more likely the child will follow through with that instruction? So timing of the prompt delivery is one. Like if you notice that if your child's watching TV after dinner and it's getting time, it's close to the time that they should be brushing their teeth, then you may want to time your prompt delivery. So, 5 or 10 minutes before the show that they're watching is over, you say, hey, when this show's done, it'll be time for you to go brush your teeth, instead of trying to pull them away from a preferred activity that's ongoing. Tone of voice in the parent's delivery, oftentimes with stuff that kids refuse often, parents are already walking into that situation anticipating that it's not going to go well. So this is another one of those situations where I really recommend using as neutral of a tone of voice as you possibly can, and avoid using like a pleading or asking tone. Try to just be firm in the way that the instruction is delivered and be clear about the expectation for completion of that instruction. And then something else that can really contribute is the inability of the child to complete all aspects of what you're asking. So this is again where I really recommend for kids who are actively refusing specific activities, even if you know they know how to do it, you can break it down into smaller steps so that they will at least get started and hopefully then complete the behavior chain on their own. And then, does a child dislike or is some sensory aspect of the action aversive for them? A lot of kids really don't like having their hair washed because they don't like the feeling of the water on their head. They don't like brushing their teeth because the feeling is not something they enjoy, or the flavor of the toothpaste is too strong, or any number of different things can contribute to something like that. So if there could be a sensory aspect to it, then I would recommend trying some different ways to get those activities completed that decrease the sensory aversiveness of that activity. And then think about what kinds of consequences typically happen after the behavior occurs or doesn't occur. So is the consequence something that's usually negative? Is it, I'm thinking of toothbrushing still just because that's the example I was using, but does it usually turn into the kid crying and then the parent really quickly brushing their teeth and being like, we just got to get this done, and it's not really it's a negative experience all around for everyone? Or do they receive some sort of reinforcement if they do complete the activity? Is that something that seems to help them? Does the child get out of doing the activity by refusing? So those are some good places to start when you're trying to figure out how to choose a strategy to use when kids are refusing. And these are questions that I typically ask, parents when I'm working with them. A lot of times it does come back in any situation to really breaking it down into what's going on in the environment, whether physical or the social environment around the child. it does come down to those factors, and really understanding those factors helps you be able to tackle that problem in a different way in the future. So we have some strategies and tips. And again, some of these strategies and tips come from different behavior analytic research. So I've attached a few different um, articles at the end that you can check out if you want to delve a little bit deeper into that. So, the number one thing you should always do when you are trying to increase direction following behavior is be sure to use an alpha command. And this is one of those terms that's referenced later. And an alpha command is when you state the direction in a clear, easy to understand, and non emotional way. So something like, please brush your teeth. It's okay to still be nice and say please, but you just say, please brush your teeth. That's it. Clear, unemotional. You're telling them exactly what the expectation is. You're not saying, you're not asking, which is the next thing that I'm asking you to avoid. You're not saying, can you brush your teeth? That leaves you open to that refusal behavior of, yeah, I can. Or, I can brush my teeth, but that doesn't mean that you've asked them to go brush their teeth. You've just asked if they know how to. So really be conscious of delivering instructions in a clear way where it's there's no question about what you're requesting of the child at that time. Or, another example of an asking question is, will you brush your teeth? Well, that could leave it open for the child again to respond verbally to you, yeah, I'll do it later, or maybe tomorrow, instead of actually knowing that what you're saying is, it's time to go brush your teeth, go brush your teeth. Another thing to try to avoid when you're giving a child an instruction is avoid implying when your expectation is specific. So I hear this phrase a lot, and I think parents have this understanding of what they're talking about when they use this phrase. But saying something like, it's getting close to bedtime, that's a general cue, sets the tone, that would set the tone for the situation, but that does not specifically tell the child, go upstairs, brush your teeth, wash your face, whatever it may be that they need to do to get ready for bedtime. It just tells them it's getting close to bedtime. That's it. So it may be implied that they should be going to brush their teeth right now, but unless you've given that alpha command, there's not really that much you can do to move that process forward if the child plans on refusing or is actively refusing. And then, although I've told you a bunch of don't do this things, I am going to tell you to not use that phrasing with kids. So, whenever possible, try to give commands to tell the child what they should be doing instead of giving them commands to tell them what they should not be doing. And this is probably the hardest thing to do, because if the kid is playing with their toys and they should be doing something else, and you're trying to tell them, don't play with that, I want you to go upstairs and do this, what they're hearing is the negative, sort of punishing language. They're not really hearing the rest of what you're saying. So giving clear expectations includes stating things in a way where you're telling the child what they should be doing instead of telling them what they shouldn't be doing. Another thing to try to avoid is let's commands. So let's brush our teeth. That's sounds really nice, and it sounds a little bit more approachable, and it goes along with the idea of a we command, like we're going to go brush our teeth, when what you really mean is you, this child, you are going to go brush your teeth. So unless you plan on doing it with them, don't use the word let's or we or anything like that. If you plan on doing it with them, then sure, use that kind of command, because that's totally fine. Some other tips and strategies are offering choices. So if you know it's a really difficult time or a difficult instruction for a child to follow, then you can present them in different ways. So offering choices would be like a this or that choice. Um, do you want to brush your teeth with the green toothbrush or with the red toothbrush? So they have a choice. They have a choice of how they complete that activity, or maybe what flavor of toothpaste, or what way they pick up their toys in. They have some choices, but in the end, you're not really offering them a choice. It's more of a forced choice where no matter what they choose, the end product is still them completing the instruction that you're trying to have met. And some kids will see right through that. So, that might not be a strategy for all kids, but it does work with younger kids, especially. You could offer choices in a this before that, and then offer the opposite sort of way. So, the sequence of activities, like, do you want to brush your teeth first, or do you want to take a bath first? Or do you want to take a bath, then brush your teeth, then read books? It doesn't really matter how you do it, but you can offer some different sequences so they feel that they have a little bit of control over when those activities happen. And some kids will choose to leave the thing they want to do the least for last. And if you find that the child is consistently doing that, you may want to stack some reinforcement after that as well. Another way to offer some choices is provide a large array of choices. I've shown you some choice boards I use in the past for like reinforcement, but you can also use choice boards to help kids set up like a schedule of non-preferred events as well. You could try using some first then language. So again, with the brush your teeth example, it's just an easy one to kind of string through the whole training. You can say first brush your teeth, and then you can whatever the reinforcing activity might be. So, first brush your teeth, and then you can play a game on the iPad or on my phone for 5 minutes. So, letting them know the expectation in a clear way is brush your teeth. That's the alpha command. So, first brush your teeth, and then letting them know what they're going to get afterwards. That can be a really good way to help motivate kids to actually follow that instruction. So, and, for some kids, one of these strategies will work for a week and then not work anymore. So that's why we list so many different types of strategies so that you can kind of rotate through them, but still string those alpha commands through any strategy that you use. The other thing, kind of piggybacking on the previous point, is use reinforcement strategies, use praise, use sticker charts, checklist. If it's something that the child is consistently having a hard time following through on, then create a consistent reinforcement response so that they're more likely to engage in the activity that you're trying to get them to engage in. And then use visuals for difficult to complete tasks. So if it's something that the child might not fully know how to do by themselves, and maybe they're resistant because they don't know how to do the activity, then using visuals is a really great way to break the task down into manageable steps. And maybe you can help them with, the first 5 steps and they complete the last 2, or have them complete the first 2 steps and you complete the last 5, and build them up to the whole chain. There's a lot of literature out there about using task lists and visuals for behavior chaining. And that's way more than I want to go into today with you guys. But if you're interested, there's a lot of information out in the world about that. And I do just want to kind of go back to the previous slide and talk a little bit about the don't commands. I know that a lot of what kids are doing when we're trying to get them to follow directions is they're engaging in problem behavior. So don't hit your brother, don't dump your toys out, don't run into the road. Those are all things that you want to say to your kids. And in the moment, I'm not saying that you should never say those phrases. If a child's running into the road, it's okay. I really strongly feel it is okay for you to go over and say, no, do not run into the road, but then follow that up with what you're expecting them to do. So do not run into the road. You can stay safe on the sidewalk. or on the lawn or wherever it might be. So whenever you find yourself saying don't do this or don't do that, make sure you pair that phrase with a follow can't say that word, a direction that can be followed. So don't do something is not a clear alpha command. It is just telling them to have the absence of a behavior. It's not telling them what their expectation is. So I could harp on that one for an hour, so I'll move on at this point. But just some food for thought there. And then a very specific strategy that is very well supported in the behavior analytic literature and works well for young kids. It works well for people with disabilities. It works for adults. It really works kind of across the board. Is using something called a high probability request sequence. And a high probability request sequence is a very it's a somewhat specific way of delivering a prompt that you know the child probably won't follow. So, this is defined as a series of requests that a student or a person is likely to perform immediately, followed by one request that they are less likely or low probability to perform. So, what you would do is you start out with 3 to 4 different high probability requests. And some examples of these are, mastered activities that the kids already know how to complete. Things that can be a little bit more fun, like let's crawl up the stairs and then roll down the rug. And these are all alpha commands. Crawl up the stairs is an alpha command. Roll down the hallway is an alpha command. And then the next one would be stand up and smile in the mirror, alpha command. Here's your toothbrush, brush your teeth, low probability request. So you have 3 alpha commands followed by that low probability one. They're more likely to engage in the behavior because you've been reinforcing them along the way for those high probability requests. So, as much as possible, I like to try to make this a really fun experience for kids, and make those high probability requests things that are, kind of funny or silly, and they inherently find some reinforcement in those. And then you can jump right into that low probability request and make that process fun as well. And then if the child starts getting, kind of off track and they start not engaging in the behavior you're looking for, you start it with those high probability requests again and just cycle through it again until you get to a point where you can throw in one that's less likely to be followed and have the child be more likely to engage in that activity because they're already in the process of getting some reinforcement for engaging in specific behaviors. So the specific steps that you would follow are you present 3 to 5 high probability requests. Again, the high probability are items that they have a high probability of completing because they're fun, because they already know how to do them. Clap your hands, touch your nose, do 5 jumping jacks. If those are things that your kids already know how to do and that you can make fun, those could be your high probability requests. I would suggest if you're trying to use this strategy, again, I'm gonna ask you guys to make a list. Make a list of a bunch of things that you know your kid already knows how to do and is pretty likely to actually do if you ask them to do it. And rotate through that list a little bit, kind of remember it for yourself or keep it on hand for difficult times. Because if you constantly do the same exact high probability requests, like touch your nose, touch your head, and then you try to throw in the low probability one, if you're doing the same ones each time for the high probability, the kids are going to catch on and potentially notice the pattern and be prepared to refuse. So, I like a list. So make a list of things you think they might do, or just kind of in the context of any activity, make a mental list really quickly of here are 10 things, there are blocks around. They're probably likely to stack the blocks if I ask them to do it. They're likely to crawl around and be silly if I ask them to do it, and make a little mental list for each different type of situation. And then you reinforce and praise along the way. And one of the things that I think can be hard to do, because it's a little, it can feel a little awkward to present this kind of strategy, but it can be a little bit hard to reinforce along the way for things that you already know your kid knows how to do. But the point of giving that reinforcement along the way is to build the momentum. And in a high probability request sequence builds some behavioral momentum. The child is, already engaging in behaviors that you're asking them to do. So they're going to be more likely to keep going with that just to access the fun a little bit more afterwards. And then the low probability request, make sure that that's, step 3, make sure that that is presented as an alpha command. In fact, make sure that all of these are presented as alpha commands so that it's really a sequence of requests that they're following. And then you praise them for completion or attempt of the low probability request. And if they don't follow through the low probability request, you prompt them maybe twice and then start the process over again. Go back to the high probability and then prompt the low probability one in the same way. That kind of gives a little bit of learning history. It teaches the child that, yeah, we can have a little bit of fun while we're doing this, but this request isn't going away. And it makes it more fun for the adult. I mean, I use this all the time in the clinic and with kids that I've worked with. It's a lot more fun if you're having fun while trying to get a kid to follow instructions. It makes it much less stressful for a parent or for a caregiver or a teacher or anyone to have this sort of lighthearted approach to getting that instruction followed. And this is a strategy that's been really well tested in homes, in schools, and across a whole variety of different ages and abilities. Any questions on that?
Tiffany, I was wondering, your low probability request, is that one something that they can still do on their own?
Yes and no. So the low probability request could be something that you're trying to get them to attempt. I think the easiest way to demonstrate that is talking actually about an academic thing. So if you're trying to teach a child to read some sight words, for example, or identify letters, and maybe they can already identify a consonant. What are the consonant, vowel, consonant word like cat? They can do small words like that, but you want to introduce something that maybe has a different type of blend or something that they haven't really been able to pronounce yet. What you would do is start with those ones that they already know, build a little bit of momentum, and then throw in the difficult one that they don't know yet. They're more likely to attempt it if they already have some reinforcement and momentum going than if you just present the one that they don't know.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it okay if they overlap? For one exact example is teaching a child to write a letter, and they're having a hard time. So you give them Play-Doh, and they form the letter with the Play-Doh. You have them write the letter. Can you still have the Play-Doh to go back and forth, or does it have to be something different, where you take the Play-Doh away and then you have them write the letters, and then if they're having trouble, you bring the Play-Doh back?
I think it depends on the kid in that situation. If the child is able to still have the Play-Doh in front of them and transition into writing, then I think that that's totally fine to leave out, and you can even keep the Play-Doh out as a reinforcing reminder or a reminder of reinforcement if that's something they want to access after. But that's a really good strategy. So, say you're trying to teach a child to write the capital letter G and they're really resistant to writing. But so, first you're like, okay, let's make a letter G, or not let's. See, I even do that. Make a letter G out of Play Doh. Great, you made a letter G out of Play Doh. That is a letter G. Now, choose a letter G out of these letter magnets. You're right, you chose the letter G. Good job. Okay, now it's time to write it. Write the letter G on the whiteboard. And then they write the letter G on the whiteboard, hopefully. If they don't end up writing it, then you squish up the Play-Doh ball and start over again, and maybe have them make the letter G out of Play-Doh or out of a different medium and put some other high probability request in front of it and then throw the writing task in again. And then once they complete that low probability request, you make a big deal about it. You're like, oh wow, you really did that. You didn't even want to. You made that letter G. That's great. Let's move on to the next letter in the alphabet. And you just kind of keep going and keep that momentum going and start again with the high probability items and build up to the low probability ones so it becomes a little bit of a rhythm.
Yeah, so overlapping and kind of combining depending on the situation, it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I strongly recommend in any interactions that you have with kids or teaching kids specific types of skills, be very flexible yourself. The child might learn the skill a little differently than you're trying to teach it, but being able to teach loosely and be flexible with the presentation of demands will make it so that you feel more successful and so that the child has more opportunities for success.
Okay.
So I guess I have a follow-up question from Sarah's question. So I guess there could be concerns if it was like in the instance of like potty training or riding a bike where they're wanting to regress back to that training wheels or training pants, the pull-ups stages, even though you've seen the success and you're wanting them to continue in that mode, and yet they kind of are trying to take the easy way out or that security of doing it in a way that they are guaranteed success for themselves and not really willing to make the attempt and push themselves, and where you kind of have to encourage them with reminders about how they have, they're ready for that next step and that they, I don't know, maybe some negotiation, but
Yeah, and I think that this this procedure works really well for very discrete requests, like something that you can very easily state and know exactly what it looks like. So when we're talking about toilet training, I would say you would want to use this procedure to teach the different steps of the toilet training procedure. And then if the child is resistant, because toileting has like a totally different kind of yucky aspect to it, you might need to use some more salient reinforcement. You may need to build in reinforcement during their sitting time. So there's a little bit more I would add into a toilet training procedure than just using something like this. But if if your child has all the steps of the toilet training down and they can recognize when they need to go and they're sitting on the toilet and you're just trying to teach them to wipe appropriately, sure, use this procedure. Like, have them do really easy things like, what shape is this piece of toilet paper? It's a square. You're right. That's great. Oh, wow. Put your hands on your lap. Great, you put your hands on your lap. Put the toilet paper in your hand. Good job, the toilet paper is in your hand. Now you wipe from front to back. And then you hand over hand teach them how to wipe from front to back. So that's the low probability request within that sequence. But the whole process of toilet training, because there are so many different steps involved in toilet training and in the toileting process, I would say you'd actually use this strategy for the discrete steps of that process, not for the whole entire thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And same with riding a bike. Actually, riding a bike, if you have a kid who has transitioned one day successfully off of their training wheels and is on the two wheels of their bike, but then the next day or the next time they go to use their bike, they want their training wheels back. You can try using a high probability request sequence in that situation. And what that really looks like with something like bike riding is, either let them ride for a little while with the training wheels back on and then take them off again later that day and have them ride longer with them off, or maybe say, you know what, let's start out with me holding the bike for you and we'll just practice this again before you go on your own, and see if they can move forward with it in that way. And I think that's something that people pretty naturally do anyway, where you might help them along until they're ready to take that next step. And and really you can shape that up time over time. Anything else on that? All right, well then we're on to our resources. So I told you I had a lot of articles that I looked at this week for to help kind of talk about these different types of procedures. And one of the links here, the top one, actually has like a really well broken down fact sheet about different types of direction following procedures. There's a really good YouTube 2-minute explanation on how to use a high probability request sequence. It's a little cartoon thing. And then, like I said, for those of you who enjoy reading articles, if you feel that way, these are the articles that I referenced in the rest of the training. And that brings us to the end of the training today. So you can find this training on our website, autismai.com. And we also have it on the Autism Advocacy and Intervention YouTube channel. That'll be up hopefully by the end of the week. I think the training from last week should be up right now. If it's not, I'll check in on that and let you guys know when it's up. And then I also just wanted to give everybody a heads up that AAI is reopening its clinic on June 1st. So we will be back in our clinic space and are still accepting new referrals and providing assessment for ABA services. And we will still continue telehealth service delivery for those families who are not interested in coming into the clinic at this time. We're really trying to cater to the family's individual needs. And throughout the rest of the summer, the Head Start locations, families in those locations and teachers in the Northeast Kingdom locations are still able to access our services throughout the summer as well. And if anyone has questions or comments, email me. And next week will actually be our last of this training series, and we're going to talk a little bit about classroom behavior strategies. So it'll be a teacher and staff focused training next week. Parents are welcome to attend, but it will be focused a little bit more on the classroom setting for next week. Does anybody have any additional things they'd like to add or any questions?
I just had a thought when you were going over the high probability request sequence page. It just kind of got me brainstorming, almost like a, Simon Says type of game where you're kind of building up that confidence and they're doing the easy things, and then you kind of throw in that one
That's
maybe they've
absolutely
been resistant to, and hope that they'll just kind of do it like reflex action without thinking.
Exactly. That's absolutely the kind of thing that I would do to make it more fun, and you build it up. I think one of the articles that I reference here, it's this one down here, it's having kids do the hokey pokey.
Oh.
So, make it fun. I think that's something I've said, pretty often with you guys. Changing a child's behavior doesn't have to be really difficult. It's something that, if you go into it with the right energy yourself, you're going to get a lot more out of it than if you're kind of going into it dreading the process. So if you can make it fun, go for it.
And then my other question and thought that as we are going along here, do any of these get implemented at meal times, or is that something where I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of parents that find themselves, or teachers sometimes, a little bit trying to negotiate of, you know, getting them to try the broccoli and trying to, get that to be more enticing, or I don't. So I was just curious what the research is or thoughts on when applying this to food strategies.
That's a really good question. Yes, you can apply these to food time. I think, again, just be careful about using food itself as a reinforcer. Instead, choose things that are non food related. But if you're trying to get a kid to try broccoli, or even just, I know that some people do the like smell, uh, lick, chew kind of thing, they don't necessarily have to swallow it. If you're trying to get them to try something new, you can totally be like, okay, take a bite of your cottage cheese. Take a bite of your pasta. Take a bite of this green thing. Okay, take a bite of cottage cheese. And you just keep on going. And maybe at one point they'll slip up and actually do it. But another, suggestion I have, if you're really trying to work more vegetables into a child's diet, there are a lot of resources out there about ways to, puree it and get it into things without them really realizing it's there. So if you're really struggling to get proper nutrition for a child, I would say start with something like that and build up to the full pieces of vegetables. I've also had a lot of success in the past. I was working with a little boy who was kindergarten aged. This was a few years ago, and he really, really didn't want to try new foods. He really only liked chicken nuggets and French fries. That's pretty much it. And what we ended up doing was I made like a little game board. It just was separated into 6 different sections, and I put pieces of food on each section. He would roll a dice, and whatever the number landed on, he had to go to that number and eat whatever food was in that section. So, there could have been like it would be like the most minuscule, like one little tiny fleck of broccoli with, um, half of the chicken nugget in that section. So you have to eat the fleck of broccoli and the chicken nugget to move on and get the rest of the nuggets. So that's a strategy I've used with kids. I would say that's a little more extreme. This was like a kid who was at risk of having some nutritional deficits from having such a limited diet. So in that situation, it was a little bit more warranted to build some reinforcement around the food into the activity. Does anybody have anything else to add? Okay, well then, thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope that I see everyone next week for our classroom-focused behavior strategy talk, and I hope you are all well, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.